The first wound was not delivered aloud. It arrived instead as silence, as the conspicuous absence of warmth in a room once promised to her. Miss Eliza Hawthorne stood beneath the blaze of chandeliers in the Ashcombe ballroom, and though music swelled and silk whispered and laughter chimed like crystal struck just so, she felt herself curiously untouched by it all, as though the night had chosen to pass her by. Faces turned, then turned away. Fans lifted. Murmurs flowed with the practiced discretion of society, each whisper polished enough to wound without leaving proof. She had been beautiful once in the simple way that did not beg to be noticed. Tonight, she was something else entirely, an object of quiet fascination, of moral speculation, of thinly veiled delight. Eliza sensed it before she saw it. The subtle narrowing of eyes, the two quick smiles that faltered upon meeting her gaze. It was astonishing how swiftly regard could curdle into judgment, how easily affection soured when opportunity presented itself. Her gown was pale blue, chosen with care, unadorned save for a modest ribbon at the waist. It had been meant to suggest humility, restraint, repentance if such were required. Yet it did nothing to soften the verdict already passed. The scandal clung to her like a second skin, invisible yet unmistakable, and no amount of propriety could persuade society to forget what it had so thoroughly enjoyed condemning. Eliza had not erred in the ways whispered of her. That mattered very little. A broken engagement, abruptly severed, had been all the invitation the world required. Motives were invented. Character was rewritten. She had been elevated, briefly, only to be cast down with equal enthusiasm. Now she stood amid the very people who had once praised her gentleness, her wit, her promise, and felt herself measured only by the story they preferred to tell. A matron she scarcely knew inclined her head with exaggerated courtesy, eyes glinting. Two young ladies paused in their laughter as Eliza passed, their silence sharp with implication. When the first strains of a waltz sounded, she waited, foolishly perhaps, for a gentleman to approach. None did. She adjusted her gloves instead, hands steady by long necessity, and reminded herself that endurance was its own quiet rebellion. From the far side of the room, the Duke of Ashcombe observed her. He had not intended to come tonight. Obligation, however, was a master he had never successfully defied. Tall, dark, composed to the point of severity, Alexander Beaumont stood apart from the crush, a figure cut from restraint itself. His expression betrayed nothing, yet his attention had fixed upon Eliza from the moment she entered, as though drawn by some force he neither welcomed nor understood. He knew the story. Everyone did. He had heard it delivered with relish over dinner tables, adorned with speculation and false certainty. But what he saw before him did not align with the narrative so eagerly consumed. He saw a woman holding herself with quiet resolve beneath the weight of unkind eyes. He saw grace unacknowledged, courage unrewarded, and something in him tightened at the injustice of it. A gentleman approached Eliza then, offering a bow that was correct in form if not in spirit. She inclined her head, hope staring despite herself. His words, however, were delivered with rehearsed regret. A prior engagement, he murmured. Another time, perhaps. He withdrew before she could reply, leaving behind the faint echo of humiliation carefully disguised as politeness. The slight was small. That was what made it so devastating. Eliza felt the room contract around her, as though the walls themselves leaned in to witness her diminishment. She breathed in slowly, steadying the ache that threatened to rise too high, too fast. It would not do to be seen faltering. Not now. Not ever. Alexander watched her lower her eyes, watched the moment she mastered herself. He saw, too, the satisfaction ripple subtly through the crowd. His jaw tightened. He had been bred to command rooms, to bend circumstance to will. Yet here, confronted with a cruelty so refined it passed for civility, he found himself momentarily powerless. The orchestra faltered, shifting into a new piece, and conversation resumed its practiced hum. Eliza moved toward the edge of the ballroom, seeking refuge near the tall windows where night pressed close and honest. Outside, carriages waited like patient beasts, unaware of the dramas unfolding within. She rested a hand against the cool glass and allowed herself a single breath of sorrow, brief and private. Behind her, somewhere in the glittering expanse, the Duke made a decision he did not yet fully comprehend. It began not with strategy, nor with ambition, but with an unmistakable pull toward the woman society had already discarded. As Eliza turned, sensing rather than seeing him, their eyes met across the room, and in that charged, fragile instant, the whispers seemed to pause, as though the world itself had taken notice. The invitation arrived 2 mornings later, delivered not by footman but by sealed carriage, its crest unmistakable even through the thin London fog. Eliza Hawthorne regarded it from her breakfast table with a mixture of dread and weary curiosity. The Duke of Ashcombe did not summon without cause, and certainly not women whose names were presently spoken with arched brows and lowered voices. She broke the seal with care, as though roughness might offend whatever fragile balance remained to her life. The note within was brief, formal, and entirely without warmth. He requested her presence that afternoon at Ashcombe House, for a matter of mutual interest. No explanation followed. Eliza read it twice, then folded it again with fingers that betrayed nothing of the unease threading through her. Declining was impossible. Accepting felt perilous. She chose the latter because it was the only choice society ever permitted women in her position. Ashcombe House rose from the street like a monument to order, its stone facade indifferent to the lives that trembled before it. Inside, the air carried the scent of polished wood and restraint. Eliza was shown into a drawing room where sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating shelves of books and a solitary figure standing with his back to her. Alexander Beaumont turned as she entered, his expression composed, his gaze steady. Up close, his presence was formidable, not in volume but in stillness. He did not rush to speak. The silence stretched, deliberate, testing. Eliza inclined her head, her posture impeccable, her pulse loud in her ears. "You asked for me, Your Grace," she said at last. "Yes," he replied, his voice low, measured. "I'm grateful you came." He gestured for her to sit, remaining standing himself. It was an imbalance she noted immediately, one that sharpened her awareness of the gulf between them. He studied her as though weighing an argument rather than a person, yet his eyes held something more searching than judgment. "I will speak plainly," he began. "Your reputation has suffered, through no fault that can be proven, yet enough to endanger your future." The words were not unkind, but they struck with practiced accuracy. Eliza met them without flinching. "You need not remind me, Your Grace." "No," he agreed. "I need only offer you an alternative." He explained then, succinctly, the necessity of his own position. The estate required stability. Parliament watched him closely. A duchess would silence certain inquiries. Appearances mattered. He proposed an arrangement, a marriage in name, mutually beneficial, discreet in its terms. Protection for her, order for him. Affection was not required. Eliza listened, her thoughts moving with surprising clarity. Shock gave way to calculation. The proposal was astonishing, audacious, and undeniably scandalous. She saw immediately how society would react, how swiftly her disgrace might be recast as triumph. Yet beneath the logic lay something colder. She would be useful, nothing more. And when the necessity passes, she asked quietly, "Then you will be free," he said, "with resources and restored standing." He produced a small velvet box, opening it without ceremony. Inside lay a ring, elegant rather than ostentatious, its stone pale and steady. A token, she understood. Proof, promise, leverage. Her breath caught despite herself. The audacity of it all pressed in upon her. She thought of the ballroom, of the turned shoulders and careful cruelties. She thought of her dwindling choices. Pride warred with survival, and survival, as ever, proved stronger. "I accept," she said, before doubt could reclaim her voice. The effect was immediate. Something flickered across his face, quickly mastered. He inclined his head, acknowledging a contract sealed by words alone. Yet as he placed the ring into her gloved hand, his fingers brushed hers, just barely, and the contact lingered a fraction longer than propriety required. News traveled faster than truth ever could. By evening, the city hummed with speculation. By morning, it roared. The fallen Miss Hawthorne, elevated to duchess. Theories abounded. Some praised the Duke's magnanimity. Others sharpened their envy into suspicion. Eliza felt the shift keenly as doors reopened and smiles returned, altered but eager. At a public reception 2 nights later, Alexander claimed her arm without hesitation. The room stilled as they entered. Whispers surged, then softened, redirected. Eliza moved beside him as though she had always belonged there, her spine straight, her expression serene. When a barbed remark was murmured too loudly, the Duke paused, turning with a gaze that silenced the offender without a word. It was a small act, yet it sent a tremor through her. Later, alone in a quiet corridor, she overheard voices drifting from an adjoining room. A gentleman spoke with careless amusement of arrangements and expedients, of how neatly the Duke had solved his problem. Eliza stood frozen, the words confirming every fear she had tried to ignore. She retreated without sound, the ring heavy on her hand, her heart heavier still, unaware that Alexander, searching for her moments later, would find only the echo of her footsteps and the first crack in a bargain already far more dangerous than either had intended. She returned home beneath a sky the color of bruised pearl, the carriage wheels striking rhythm against the cobbles as though counting the cost of her decision. In her sitting room, she removed her gloves slowly, studying her reflection in the mirror as if it belonged to another woman entirely. The ring caught the lamplight, casting a pale glimmer across the wall. She told herself it was armor, not a shackle, yet the distinction felt perilously thin. Somewhere across the city, the Duke of Ashcombe stood at his window, equally wakeful, equally unsettled, replaying the moment she had said yes and wondering, for the first time in years, whether control had already slipped beyond his grasp. By dawn, both would rise changed, bound by promise and pretense, while London waited, breath held, eager to see whether salvation or ruin would be the true reward of such a union. Illness arrived quietly, as it often did in houses built to deny vulnerability. Eliza woke before dawn with her throat raw and her limbs aching, the fire long reduced to embers. By evening, rain battered the windows of Ashcombe House, and propriety surrendered to necessity. Alexander dismissed the servants himself, his expression unreadable as he led her to the library, where warmth and lamplight gathered like confidants. The room smelled of leather and smoke, of years spent guarding truths. Eliza sank into a chair, pale and trembling, pride finally conceding to weakness. Silence pressed close, demanding honesty neither had rehearsed. She apologized for the inconvenience before he could speak, the habit ingrained too deeply to resist. Alexander shook his head, pouring water with hands that betrayed a faint tension. He had seen her composed before crowds, unyielding beneath scrutiny, yet this quieter fragility unsettled him more. When she thanked him for his consideration, the words struck oddly, as though she mistook duty for distance. He realized then how carefully she kept herself contained, how rarely anyone asked what endurance cost her. Something protective, unwanted, and dangerously tender stirred behind his carefully governed reserve, challenging assumptions he believed immovable until now. Thunder rolled distantly as he took the chair opposite her, lowering himself to her level at last. The simple gesture shifted something unspoken between them. She studied his face in the softened light, noting lines of restraint rather than age, shadows carved by responsibility rather than indulgence. He asked if she regretted the arrangement, voice careful, controlled. The question startled her with its intimacy. She answered honestly that regret felt like a luxury, one she could no longer afford, though uncertainty haunted her quiet hours. Admitting fear aloud seemed riskier than any gossip society might invent about her future entirely. Alexander listened, something tightening at the edges of his composure. He had intended this marriage to be a solution, elegant and contained, yet her words exposed the human cost he had willfully ignored. He spoke then of duty, of inheritance, of how affection complicated decisions men like him were raised to master. His voice did not soften, but honesty threaded through it. Eliza sensed a door opening briefly, revealing loneliness carefully buried beneath command. It was not confession, yet it carried the weight of one withheld by habit and fear, shaped by years of solitary authority and expectation alone always. The storm intensified, rain streaking down the tall windows like restless thoughts. Eliza rose unsteadily, compelled by an impulse she did not fully trust. She thanked him again, this time for speaking plainly, and surprised herself by touching his sleeve in quiet emphasis. The contact was brief, accidental enough to excuse, deliberate enough to linger. Alexander froze, every lesson of restraint warring with an instinct to steady her, to bridge the space he had insisted upon maintaining. His heart betrayed him with a single, undeniable beat he could neither command nor dismiss without consequence or acknowledgement from either of them. They stood so, suspended, until Eliza withdrew her hand as though burned by propriety itself. Apologies rushed to her lips, unnecessary and unwanted. Alexander spoke her name then, softly, without title, and the sound altered the room. She looked at him, startled by the intimacy of it. In that moment, she glimpsed something dangerous in his restraint, a feeling carefully guarded yet unmistakably alive, waiting only for permission neither dared grant. The realization unsettled her more than cruelty ever had, because it suggested hope where she had learned caution and vulnerability neither could afford publicly under present circumstances or consequences. Her strength returned enough for resolve to follow. She told him she would not cling to illusions, that she understood the boundaries of their agreement. Alexander inclined his head, yet disappointment flickered before he could suppress it. He assured her she owed him nothing beyond appearances. The words, meant kindly, landed heavily. She realized then how differently they defined freedom, how his was chosen while hers was negotiated. The imbalance sharpened her determination to remain grateful but untouched, safe within emotional distance even as longing threatened to erode carefully built defenses she had fortified through years of disappointment alone entirely. A servant knocked discreetly, announcing supper, and reality intruded once more. Eliza gathered herself, the moment folding away like a secret letter. Alexander offered his arm, hesitation barely perceptible, and she accepted with formal grace. As they walked, neither spoke, yet awareness pulsed between them, newly charged. What had been arrangement now bore the fragile weight of unspoken truth, altering every glance, every pause, every careful choice yet to come. The house seemed to hold its breath, as though acknowledging a shift it could neither prevent nor fully contain within stone walls long accustomed to silence and restraint alone together. That night, in separate chambers, sleep eluded them both. Eliza lay listening to rain soften into mist, replaying his voice speaking her name. Alexander stood at his window, staring into darkness, confronting the truth he had avoided, that proximity had awakened something he could no longer dismiss as duty's echo. Each understood, privately, that pretending would grow harder now, that distance would demand greater effort than closeness. The arrangement, once defined by clarity, now blurred with feeling neither could afford to name, yet both sensed inevitability pressing forward, reshaping futures already set in careful ink by others long ago irrevocably. Morning would demand composure, smiles, and the continued performance of convenience. Yet something irretrievable had been exchanged in that lamplit room, something neither contract nor caution could fully contain. As dawn crept toward Ashcombe House, Eliza resolved to guard her heart more fiercely than ever. Across the hall, Alexander acknowledged, with quiet certainty, that restraint alone would no longer suffice, and that the greatest danger ahead lay not in scandal, but in the truth waiting patiently between them. Neither yet understood how soon that truth would demand to be spoken aloud before pretense collapsed entirely under weight of love alone. The evening of the declaration arrived dressed in splendor and threat, as though the city itself sensed a reckoning. Chandeliers blazed within Ashcombe House, scattering light across marble and silk, while carriages lined the drive in obedient formation. Eliza stood at the threshold of the ballroom, her reflection fractured by mirrors, her breath measured to the rhythm of survival. Tonight, she had resolved to end the arrangement with dignity intact, to to release the Duke from obligation before affection hardened into illusion. Her heart ached with the resolve, yet her spine remained unbent, rehearsed in courage. Alexander observed the gathering with practiced calm, though every movement of the crowd felt amplified by anticipation. Parliamentarians, titled widows, and curious cousins filled the room, each hungry for spectacle disguised as celebration. He knew Eliza intended to speak tonight. He had sensed the steel beneath her composure all day. The knowledge unsettled him more than any political risk. When he crossed the floor toward her, murmurs followed like a tide. He wondered, not for the first time, whether he would survive the cost of silence if he allowed her to go. She turned to face him beneath the chandelier's glare, society closing its circle with polite attention. Eliza spoke before fear could intervene, her voice steady though her hands trembled within their gloves. She thanked him publicly for his generosity, then announced she would not hinder his future by clinging to a pretense grown dangerous. Each word fell like a measured blade, carving distance she believed merciful. Gasps rippled outward. Alexander felt the room tilt. In that instant, strategy dissolved, replaced by something fierce, personal, and irrevocably human. He stepped forward before thought restrained him, breaking the choreography of decorum that governed every noble assembly. His voice carried without force, quiet yet absolute, commanding attention through truth rather than rank. He denied her renunciation, declaring it unnecessary and unjust. Then, with the world listening, he confessed that the arrangement had been a lie. He told himself that his regard for her had preceded convenience, strategy, even consent. He spoke of the night she stood alone beneath judgment and how something in him recognized courage worth choosing, not borrowing. The room seemed to forget itself, etiquette suspended by the gravity of sincerity. Eliza stared at him, disbelief warring with longing so sharp it nearly stole her breath. No man had ever claimed her so plainly, without apology or bargain. He continued, unflinching, stating that love, once realized, was not weakness but resolve made visible. If she wished freedom, he would grant it. If she wished truth, he offered his without defense. The choice, he said, belonged to her entirely. Her reply did not come at once. The silence stretched, laden with consequence. Every observer caught between voyeurism and reverence. Eliza searched his face for deceit and found none, only vulnerability stripped bare by decision. She spoke then, softly, confessing her fear of being loved as a solution rather than a soul. She admitted how close she had come to disappearing with ingratitude. Alexander listened as though the world had narrowed to her voice alone, understanding finally that love required courage not merely to declare, but to receive. When she accepted him, it was without flourish, a simple affirmation spoken with trembling certainty. The crowd exhaled as one, scandal transforming into legend before their eyes. Alexander bowed his head briefly, a gesture of reverence rather than triumph, then offered his arm. Eliza took it, feeling the shift in how the room regarded her, not redeemed but claimed. Music resumed, cautious at first, then swelling, as though society itself scrambled to reassemble dignity from surprise and awe, uncertain whether it had witnessed romance or rebellion. Yet beneath the applause and renewed civility, uncertainty lingered, for declarations could not erase consequence. As the night waned, Eliza and Alexander stood together near the windows, city lights blinking like watchful eyes. She understood now that love invited scrutiny fiercer than scandal, that choosing him meant choosing visibility, judgment, and devotion intertwined. He squeezed her hand, a silent vow, while his gaze drifted outward, calculating battles yet unfought. Tomorrow would bring questions, resistance, perhaps retaliation from those unsettled by sincerity. For now, they shared a fragile triumph, knowing resolution had been spoken but not yet secured, and that the greatest test of love would arrive not in words, but in endurance. Morning arrived without ceremony, pale light settling over Ashcombe House as though the night's upheaval had been a dream reluctantly remembered. Eliza woke with clarity rather than fear, the declaration still echoing in her thoughts, no longer fragile but resolute. When she rose, servants moved with renewed attentiveness, their deference altered, not warmer, but steadier. The house itself seemed to recognize her now, corridors less forbidding, mirrors less accusatory. She dressed without haste, choosing simplicity over display, determined that love, if it endured, would do so without ornament. Alexander awaited her in the small morning room overlooking the gardens, where frost lingered on winter roses. He turned at her entrance, relief flickering before composure reclaimed him. They spoke little at first, sharing silence shaped by mutual understanding rather than restraint. He offered tea. She accepted. It was a domestic gesture, unremarkable yet profound, anchoring last night's boldness in daylight. When he apologized for placing her under such scrutiny, she answered that visibility was preferable to erasure. The words settled between them like a promise neither wished to test too soon. The city, however, wasted no time. Letters arrived before noon, some congratulatory, others cautious, a few sharp with displeasure. Parliament murmured. Relations questioned. Alexander addressed each with measured firmness, neither defensive nor contrite. He stood beside Eliza when required, never before her, never behind. Observers noted the difference. Where once she had been shielded by his title, she now stood supported by his choice. The distinction mattered, and it altered the narrative more effectively than any proclamation could have managed. A final challenge emerged that afternoon in the form of Eliza's former fiancé, emboldened by resentment and public curiosity. He demanded audience, alleging impropriety, questioning motive. Alexander granted the meeting, refusing spectacle. Eliza attended by her own decision, spine straight, voice unyielding. She spoke of autonomy, of how easily affection became entitlement when men mistook silence for consent. The confrontation ended not in triumph, but in dismissal, the past released without cruelty. When the door closed, Eliza exhaled, understanding fully that reclaiming dignity required witness as much as courage. Their wedding followed without extravagance yet with unmistakable intention. Invitations were selective, vows spoken with gravity rather than flourish. Eliza walked the aisle aware of every step, not toward rescue, but toward partnership freely chosen. Alexander watched her approach with reverence that eclipsed pride, knowing the title he offered was lesser than the life he promised to share. When their hands joined, it was not to bind obligation, but to affirm trust forged under scrutiny. The chapel held its breath, history yielding quietly to something newly honest. That evening, Ashcombe House hosted a quieter gathering, intimate rather than grand. Friends arrived who valued sincerity over gossip. Music drifted softly. Eliza moved among them with confidence earned, not bestowed. Alexander watched her, recognizing the woman she had always been, now simply unobscured. When they danced, it was not for society's benefit but for each other, steps unhurried, laughter rare yet genuine. In that motion, he understood that love's endurance lay not in spectacle, but in repetition, in choosing again what had already been chosen once. Later, beneath the stars, Alexander led Eliza into the garden. Winter air sharpened their breath, yet warmth lingered between them. He spoke of the future not as strategy, but as shared labor, of seasons yet to come, of mistakes forgiven in advance. Eliza listened, then answered with honesty equal to his own. She admitted fear would return, that scars did not vanish with happiness. He accepted this without protest, loving her not despite resilience, but because of it. Their kiss, when it came, was unhurried, reverent, sealing intention rather than desire alone. In the weeks that followed, whispers softened, then faded, replaced by newer scandals, fresher curiosities. Society moved on, as it always did. What remained was quieter and stronger. Eliza found her voice within the household, shaping charity, hosting salons where thought mattered more than pedigree. Alexander learned to yield without diminishing himself, discovering leadership strengthened by partnership. Together, they rewrote expectation not through defiance, but through consistency, allowing time to validate what courage had first declared aloud. Their union reshaped the household in subtle ways. Servants spoke more freely, laughter returning to corridors long governed by restraint. Decisions once issued in solitude became conversations, informed by two perspectives equally weighted. Eliza's influence was not loud, but it was persistent, steering tradition toward compassion without dismantling its foundations. Alexander, observing this transformation, recognized leadership not as command, but as stewardship shared with trust. Years later, portraits would hang in Ashcombe House depicting a duke and duchess whose expressions bore unmistakable equality. Visitors would remark upon the calm between them, the sense of deliberate affection unmarred by performance. Few would remember the whispers that once threatened ruin. Fewer still would understand how close the world had come to losing a woman unwilling to be erased, or a man brave enough to choose love before certainty. Time affirmed what declaration began. Seasons turned, challenges arose, yet their bond matured rather than fractured. Disagreements sharpened understanding instead of distance, and compromise became an act of devotion. They learned that love was not sustained by grand gestures alone, but by patience practiced daily, by listening when silence tempted withdrawal, and by choosing grace when pride offered easier refuge. On a quiet morning much like the first, Eliza stood at the window watching light gather across the gardens. Alexander joined her, their hands finding one another without thought. The past no longer pressed upon them. It informed without wounding. Together, they faced forward, knowing endurance was not the absence of struggle, but the decision to remain present when whispers faded and only truth endured. The world beyond the estate continued its restless turning, indifferent and loud. Yet within their shared life, meaning endured, shaped by choice rather than chance, by courage renewed each day, and by love that asked not for permission, only constancy. It was enough, and always would be.